All right, we're getting started here. Well, I just want to say welcome. My name is Jeff. I'm the pastor here at Calvary Chapel, and we were blessed to have this fall into our lap. So we're going to welcome Michael Oard up here, but I just wanted to pray first, okay? Lord, we are so grateful for the opportunities you give us to gather together. And Lord, look at these things and consider, Lord, what you have done. And Lord, I thank you for men like Michael that look into these things and pull out evidences for us to ponder over and to use as we communicate the gospel to other people. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for how you work. And Lord, may your hand of blessing be upon this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, couple of points. There are two bathrooms if you go out these doors to the right, there's a men's and ladies. We still believe in men's and ladies. And there's a men's and ladies room out in the foyer as well. So there's some goodies out there. You are welcome to bring them in here. There's coffee and tea out there as well for you during the event. And if you could make sure your phone's on silent so we could all hear, we'll have a great time listening to Michael. Please welcome Mike Oard.
Oh, good. Am I working here? Okay. Ooh. Am I still working? I thought I had the power on.
There's a mute on top. There, now you're unmuted.
Oh, I'm unmuted?
There you go.
Okay.
Now you're on fire.
Okay. Good evening. I just happened to be in this area, and my sister-in-law, Leanna Luloff, happened to arrange this event. I'm only here 2 days. I was attending a family reunion. Anyway, I've been a creation researcher in neurosciences for 50 years. I have a BS and an MS degree in atmospheric science from the University of Washington. And so I was a weather forecaster for 30 years in the National Weather Service and retired and do this full time, speaking I'm mostly a researcher. So as a result, I've developed all kinds of resources, as you saw out there, for all ages. I'll tell you more about them as we go. Oh yeah, we almost didn't get it up. But anyway, it's working, so here we go. Astounding evidence for Noah's flood. Okay. Why isn't this going forward? I haven't had problems with the technology for 15 years.
I wonder if it's just All right, I'll be right back.
Thank the Lord for computer techies. I have my son is a computer techie, and so does his son. And so they do all my tough work, so I'm computer challenged as a result. We couldn't get it up on my laptop, and we had 2 thumb drives with it on, but it finally worked back there.
All right, we'll give that a shot.
Okay. Anyway, some preliminaries before we get started in the astounding geological evidence for the Genesis flood. Scriptural evidence. I start with Scripture first and then go to look at geology. Scriptural evidence. Boy, I'll tell you, these slides are not. Anyway, the context. of Genesis 6 to 9 has 30 universal terms, as I'll quote some. Now it's true when someone says all the earth or all, generally it refers to a regional area. But when you have 30 of them, you might want to think maybe it's global. But there's a lot of other indications that the flood is global. For instance, the ark landed in the mountains. If you were in a, by the way, what I'm talking to you about is many churches believe in a local flood, both Catholic and Protestant. So that's why I'm going to start with evidence against the local floods first. Now, in a local flood, if you happen to be caught in a boat, you'd go downstream and end up in the floodplain or even out into the ocean. But you're not going to go backwards up into the mountains. So the ark landing in the mountains is what you'd expect for a global flood. The first places they're going to see is the mountainous areas. The tops of the mountains were seen after they landed in the mountains of Ararat in 75 days. What kind of local flood is that? Seeing the tops of the rest of the mountains after 75 days. Why bring any of those animals on the ark? You don't need to because they're around somewhere around the world. It makes no sense for God to send all those animals on the ark. Noah did not have to trap them, by the way. And a 371-day flood is hardly local. The covenant of the rainbow would make no sense if it was a local flood because God has broken his promise tens of thousands of times. And the animals were told to repopulate the earth. Why repopulate if they're just 100 miles away? And also the sons of Noah were told to repopulate the earth. Why would they be told that if people were around just close by? And here's a little quote from Genesis 7:19 to 20. The waters prevailed more and more on the earth, so that all the high mountains, everyone under the heavens were covered. That sounds like a global flood to me. And here's a little cartoon that demonstrates the issue. Look at that beautiful rainbow. It's a promise from God that he'll never send a flood. He'll flood the entire earth as he did Noah's day. He told you it was just a localized flood. That's what he said. So he believes that God promised to never send a localized flood. And by the way, at a lot of Christian colleges, Bible schools, universities, they will teach the local flood, even though it's totally against Scripture. God couldn't have said it any more different. It's a global flood. Also, people say, well, you can't get all those species of animals on the ark. It's too small. Well, let's take a better look at this. First of all, you don't need millions of species on the ark because it says he brought 2 of each unclean kind. It's kind that counts. And kind, we know now, is generally at a higher level in the biological classification system than the species. The system starts with species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom. And now there's a whole area of creation biology called baraminology that's trying to determine what is the boundary of the kinds. And they generally think it's at the family level. Now, if the kind was at the genus level, you only need about 16,000 animals on the ark. If it's at the family level, you only need a couple thousand. So there's plenty of room on the ark, especially when you know how big the ark was from the Bible. 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet tall, and it has a ratio of 6-to-1 length to width, similar to modern ships and barges. And there's a dinosaur and a school bus and some boxcars for scale. So the ark was huge. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of room for people to have come on the ark who wanted to repent, but only 8 did. If you want to know more about this, you can get this book right here online. I don't have any copies of it. John Rubinoff, Noah's Ark, a feasibility study. He goes through every possible objection the critics can give us, and he shoots them down. Like, how do you take care of all those animals? Does Noah have to go out and trap all those microorganisms to bring them on the ark? I mean, a lot of times they're really silly things, but he deals with them. Anyway, what did Jesus say about the flood? Did he say have anything to say? Yeah, he did. In Matthew 24:37-39, he says, "For as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark." See, Jesus believed that Noah was a real person. The ark was a real boat. "And they knew not until the flood came and took a few of them away in a local flood, took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Now, some people say that, well, this all here just means regional areas, which can be. But he's comparing this flood to a second coming. And in Revelations 1:7, it says, when Jesus comes back, all eyes will see him. So it's going to be a global coming back. So he's not going to compare a global coming back to a local event, is he? But to a global flood. Jesus believed in a global flood, and I'm certainly going to believe it. So let's get into the evidence. And there's going to be generally 4 types from hundreds of flood traditions all over the earth. From strata. Strata means sedimentary rocks. That's geological jargon. From fossils, and from something called geomorphology. Geo means earth, morphology means shape. Essentially, the shape of the surface of the earth shows evidence of the runoff of the floodwaters, the last event of the flood. And I'm going to specifically showcase planation surfaces. I'll define all these things. Long transported hard rocks and water and wind gaps. Anyway, when I do my research, by the way, I keep up with 50 earth science journals in the Montana State University Library in Bozeman. So I know what our challenges are. And so we have hundreds of challenges in the earth sciences. But we got answers. Anyway, you hear things like this. Mainstream science has no attempt whatsoever to refute flood geology. That's the flood, of course. A hypothesis vaguely and confusingly worded, lacking in completeness of statement, and nearly devoid of evidence. It says nearly devoid of evidence. Now, Arthur Strahler is an atheist, and he's an atheist geologist. He was writing from the point of view as an atheist, but he did his homework. He read our material. We have 60 years of technical research on the creation science issue, 60 years worth. And we have a lot of technical books, we have popular books, we have children's books, and lots of DVDs. But at this time, 1987, he did his homework. And he did a good job of criticizing us because he got what we believed correct first. But he got half of it was wrong because he's an atheist. But this guy right here said there is no geological evidence to confirm the idea of a universal deluge. Davis Young, retired professor of geology at Calvin College. He says there's no evidence. And of all places, it's in a book he wrote called The Biblical Flood. Arthur Strahler says we have a little bit of evidence. He says none. So, by the way, I read stuff like this all the time. I read our critics and see what they have to say. You know what I find? They're not like Arthur Strahler. They're not very good scholars because the first thing, they don't find out what we believe. They don't hardly read any of our material. If they do, it's some old book or old article. A lot of times they're poor scholars, and then they set up what they think we believe in, and that's, in logic it's called a straw man argument. Really easy to cut down with a sword, and that's what they do. And I still read their material. But anyway, this is what I do when I come across things like this. This is my theme verse for research. In fact, it's a good theme verse for life. Examine everything carefully, hold fast to that which is good. You hold fast to the Bible as God's word, but then you examine everything. And it's got to be careful. If you don't examine it in depth, you probably shouldn't examine it at all and not make decisions on on it one way or another, because you don't have enough information. got to examine things carefully. And when I examine challenges carefully, by the way, the Lord has led me over 50 years of research to examine challenges, not necessarily to shoot down evolution, which is surprisingly easy. Surprisingly easy. I was amazed when I went into it. Anyway, so let's get into the evidence. Evidence from flood traditions. Anyway, there's hundreds of these flood traditions all over the earth from all people groups, practically all, hundreds of them. And a lot of them are remarkably similar, especially the ones closer to the Middle East. As you get further away, not so much so, but they are. Like the reason we have a red triangle there is because sometimes you can't really tell what they're saying, so you give them a partial representation of the events in Genesis. But the Syro-Babylonian ones are the closest, and one of them is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Has anyone ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh? Just a couple of you. Anyway, you have to have some scholar or theologian get the bright idea that, hey, Moses borrowed it from these people, the Syrian Babylonians. Oh, but you can check that out because the boat in the Epic of Gilgamesh is 130 feet by 130 feet by 130 feet. It's a cube. What's a cube going to be doing in rough seas? Well, the ark is the shape of a ship or barge, very reasonable, can handle a lot of, have you seen some Korean creationists did some research on it and conclude that you'd have to be hit broadside by a wave 200 feet tall to topple it. Very stable. So let's get into evidence from strata. Or sedimentary rocks. But first of all, we're going to have to diagram the flood from a hydrological point of view. That's the science of water or flooding. Anyway, just like any flood, the water goes up and the water goes down. So when it goes up, it's a flooding stage. And during the flooding stage, you erode a huge amount of rock from somewhere and deposit it on the continents. And I've determined, I and a couple others have done research on how much is there, and we estimate maybe 3,500 meters or 10,000 feet of sediments were collected on the average on all the continents at the peak of the flood. Then during the retreating stages, the floodwaters were washing off the continents as the continents were coming up out of the floodwaters, ocean basin sinking. There's geological evidence for this, by the way. The waters were rushing off, sometimes at high speed, and eroding a huge amount of what was deposited and forming the continental shelf. And that's called the retreating stage. And we can divide that up into all this into phases, but I'm not going to go into detail in that. But I'll say something about phases 4 and 5 later. But that's kind of the diagram. And the sedimentary rock, the strata, sediments were deposited in the first 150 days during the flooding stage. And Grand Canyon is a great road cut to see all this. We love road cuts. I looked at one near Sela, and boy, nice volcanic rounded rocks and indicating torrential flows. Anyway, this is Grand Canyon, about 4,000 to 5,000 feet of horizontal sedimentary rocks, claimed to represent 250 million years, the secular scientists do. But we can take a look at some of these layers in here and trace them over long distances. For instance, this layer at the bottom of the Grand Canyon is called the Tapete Sandstone. This layer right here is a sandstone called the Coconino Sandstone, and they both outcrop the total distance of Grand Canyon about 200 miles. And I'll tell you the significance of that as soon as I show you what it looks like. The sand lies on the upper crustal rocks. See, the world is considered, got the crust, mantle, and core. And the upper crustal rocks of the continents are mostly granite rocks, granitic type rocks. And this is sitting on granitic type rocks in most areas. And it's a coarse-grained sandstone. You can see some of the quartz grains for pebbles, probably eroded from a granite terrain, of which quartz being the most resistant rock, granite is made up of 4 different types of minerals, but quartz is the most resistant mineral, and that's probably what's left after you erode. So this is about 100 to 300 feet thick. And you can trace it from Grand Canyon up to where I live up in here, Montana and Wyoming. And it's given different names in different states because the early geologists loved to name things and they didn't know they were connected. It's called the Flathead Sandstone where I located. And you can trace that same sandstone, oops, I didn't want to do that, underneath in the Midwest, clear to the Appalachians, and even the Canadian Rockies up to the Northeast Canada. So that sandstone, 100 to 300 feet thick of almost pure sand, covers about half of North America. So what's the significance of that? Well, if you understand, how many have heard of the term uniformitarianism? Okay, I'm probing you to see where you're at, so I'll explain it. Uniformitarianism is what they believe, how all the rocks and fossils got there. It means uniform processes over millions of years. In other words, present processes we see going on today account for all the sedimentary rocks. Well, what kind of present processes? Well, we're talking about sediments, so we're talking about floods. And what kind of floods do we see today? Local floods. And they might deposit material in a floodplain, maybe 10 miles long, or out into a river delta in the ocean. Those are the processes. And that's what we're supposed to use to account for all these rocks. Well, what kind of present process will account for half of North America be covered with 100 to 300 feet of almost pure sand? Yeah. You know, that's powerful evidence for Noah's flood because the flood would rip up sediments from somewhere and deposit over large areas quickly. And then when we keep going, this is the Flathead Sandstone near Cody, Wyoming, the same type of sandstone on top of granite of the upper crust. Okay, we go back to Grand Canyon and notice a few other things. Here's a planation surface, but I'll talk about that later. But notice that these sedimentary rocks are flat, one on top of another. And we know there's little, if any, erosion in there. There's sometimes a little tiny parabolic scour, but that's about it. Otherwise, they're flat over the whole distance. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, in 250 million years, you can erode North America down to sea level at the present rate 25 times. Erosion over a million-year timescale is rapid. All the continents could be in 10 million years, but that's a minimum because as the mountains wear down, the erosion rate decreases. So you got to put some caveats on it, but you can't go past 50 million years. That's a maximum. So if all the continents could be eroded to sea level in 10 to 50 million years, where is the evidence of erosion in that pile of sediments 250 million years long? There should be canyons in that, valleys in the walls, you see. Even if those sediments were laid down in, say, 1 million years. This is kind of a little schematic. This is granite right here, and here's 4 layers laid down over 200 miles in Grand Canyon. As you go, erosion will form valleys. That. And then say we had another sedimentation event, like it dropped below sea level a little bit and had a lot of sediment. It'd end up like this. And then you can do it again. And you'd end up with all these valleys and canyons in the walls. Do we see that? No, we see something like this. Sometimes they will pinch out, or some layers and thicken, but others remain the same for 200 miles. And the significance of that is that's exactly what we expect in the flood. but not in 250 million years. This erases 250 million years. And we have lots of other evidence that those millions of years don't exist too. I'll talk a little bit about maybe later on. But this is exactly what we expect in Noah's flood, where it laid sedimentary rocks over a huge area, one layer after another, quickly. And even some secular scientists admitted this. This is the Grand Teton Mountains. Has anyone been to the Grand Teton Mountains before? Yeah, beautiful mountains. They're my favorite mountain range. There is Grand Teton right there, but this is the south side. On the south and north side, you have tilted sedimentary rocks about 3,000 to 4,000 feet thick. And they're horizontal. That represents the bottom two-thirds of Grand Canyon, up 600 miles north in the Grand Tetons. And 6 geologists did some research there, and they said this when they looked at the layers. The regularity and parallelism of the layers in the well-exposed sections suggest that all these rocks were deposited in a single, uninterrupted sequence. But do they believe it? No. However, the fossils and regional distribution of the rock units show that this is not really the case. The incomplete nature of the stratigraphic record becomes apparent when the spans of time represented by each of the various formations are plotted on the numerical time scale. And that's the numerical time scale. 500 million, and these are the bottom 3 formations. Here's one here, and there's 2 more up here. And all this white here is missing time. Here's 80 million years missing. Where's the erosion as evidence? It's not there. And by the way, geologists that study the sedimentary rocks say that even in these layers, it looks like this was deposited over 10 million years. But no, it was deposited over, it's full of gaps that you can't see. A little bit for maybe 10,000 and more, 100,000 years later, and so forth. All these layers here are not continuous. They're full of gaps. In fact, they said that their time scale is represented by only 1% of the sedimentary rocks. 1%. 99% is gaps. Not there. So, but it's powerful evidence for Noah's flood. Okay, let's go to evidence from fossils. How do you form a fossil? Well, it can't just sit out in the ground after it dies. No, you need it to be buried rapidly. And it must be fossilized before it decays. The soft parts will decay rapidly. And by the way, we're finding out there's a lot of soft parts or soft tissues with dinosaurs now, and other organisms besides dinosaurs. Chemicals must be forced into the bone or shell before it rots, usually from the environment. That's special conditions. That's why fossilization is very rare today. It occurs in the right position, like around hot springs, where you have cementing agents like silica that are readily available. But we have billions, if not trillions, of fossils in the sedimentary rocks. And that's why Ken Ham's saying makes really a lot of sense. It seems simplistic, but it makes sense. You know, what do we expect in a global flood? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. That is exactly what we have. And they're in massive graveyards. We have graveyards in Montana, 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs of all the same species. Very unusual, nothing like it today. And that's why Jack Horner, the dinosaur man from Montana State University, said this has to be a catastrophic inundation. But this is a graveyard of ammonites. Those are coiled, shelled organisms that are marine organisms. The pearly nautilus is the only one that exists today. They're practically all extinct. And then we have a lot of unique fossils like this. fish eating a fish, buried, fossilized before it can swallow its dinner. And then we have this unique fossil right here, an ichthyosaur, an extinct marine reptile, fossilized to the point of giving birth. Now that's pretty rapid fossilization, isn't it? And 95% of fossils are mollusks. They're shelled organisms like a clam, but there's a lot of other ones like oysters and an organism called a brachiopod, which is like a clam. Most mollusks in the fossil record are closed-shelled. And the muscle attachment decays in a matter of days to weeks, and the shell opens up. The fact that so many are closed-shelled indicates rapid burial. And here's a sample from Western Oregon from my friend. Clams, brachiopods, and oysters, closed-shelled. All over the earth. A global event. Now we're going to get into evidence from geomorphology. And a lot of this has applications around here, by the way. I've done a lot of my research in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, and even in Saskatchewan and Alberta, Canada. Evidence from geomorphology. Like I said, geo means earth, morphology means shape, the shape of the earth. What kind of shapes? Mountains. They call them landforms, form of the land, like you have a mountain, or you have a plateau, or a river valley. It can be a lot of different things. And the interesting about this field is that practically every major event in geomorphology defies uniformitarianism. Present processes aren't forming these things today. They're destroying them. But they're readily available, readily seen. So let's go back to this diagram right here. And we're in the retreating stage where you eroded the top of the 10,000 feet off. And me and 3 others have recently finished a research project published in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, one of our technical journals that's been around almost 60 years, on how much sediment was eroded off. I've been wondering about that for 30 years, and I've been taking measurements in various areas and getting big numbers, by the way. So based on the amount of sediments off the coast, which is very thick on the continental margins, like on the East Coast, you have up to 18 kilometers, that's about, 10 miles of sediment piled up. Gulf of Mexico is very thick. The Arctic Ocean, along the edge of the Arctic Ocean, has about 10 miles of sediment piled up, all coming from the continents, eroded off. So based on that, we estimated 1,900 meters, or about 5,000 feet, was eroded off during this retreating stage in 2 phases. Phase 4 is by wide currents. Maybe it's 1,000 miles wide and 5 miles deep, moving across the earth as the continents were coming up, eroding huge chunks of sedimentary rocks. And then phase 5 is when you have mountains and plateaus exposed above the floodwaters. It's forcing the water to channelize around there, forming canyons and water and wind gaps and valleys rapidly. The flood forms things rapidly. And here's a little block diagram showing this. There's the 1,900 meters. This is what it was at day 150 up in this area. And this is the present continental surface where you find a lot of dinosaur fossils. And 1,900 meters were eroded. That's about 5,000 feet. And we're still trying to figure out what's left. But we're getting some numbers. And we're getting numbers of around 3,000 to 5,000 feet average. We're going state by state. Some states have little. Some states have a huge amount. We haven't gone west of the Rockies yet because it's extremely complicated in this area. So that's the big picture. And it's saying that we're trying to figure out if you have 10,000 feet of sediments deposited on the continents 150 days, you got to erode it from somewhere. We don't know where it came from, how it was transported. So, we got some things to deal with. So there's a bunch of us working on what's called the flood model. So we're trying to figure out the details. We got a lot of details down already, but we still have a lot to go. Anyway, I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, planation surfaces. What is a planation surface? Well, first of all, I'll define an erosion surface from the Dictionary of Geological Terms. It's an erosion surface shaped and subdued by the action of erosion. That's not very insightful, but it says especially by running water. In other words, all the erosion is done by running water somehow. Well, how do they know that? Well, a lot of times they have these rounded rocks. By the way, if I knew I was going to give this talk, I didn't know until I was in Portland, and I would have brought you some fossils. I would have brought you some rounded rocks with percussion marks on them that you find on the tops of mountains and plateaus. Anyway, the term is generally applied to a level or nearly level surface. If it's kind of rolling, if it's been eroded down to generally a rolling surface like this, which some of them are, it's called an erosion surface. But if it's dead flat, it's called a planation surface. I'll just call them planation surfaces to simplify. So let's take a look at one. This is in the northern Bighorn Basin, north central Wyoming. And here's a planation surface right here. And you can see the sedimentary rocks tilted at various angles down. There probably was a dome that went up like this. And something just sheared it off all flat, both hard and soft rocks the same. And left about 15 feet of rounded rocks, rounded by the action of water on top. And I'm on the other side of this valley. And right in here. And a lot of the rocks are quartzites that came from central Idaho. I'll get into that next. And some of the tops of mountains you see are planation surface. These are the highest mountains in Montana, the Beartooth Mountains, 13,500 feet. That's granite, plain flat. Nature's not doing that today. It's not forming any flat surfaces anywhere. It's destroying them. That's what modern present-day processes show, which defies uniformitarianism. And this is east of the Continental Divide. We have planation surfaces at 4 levels. The highest level is the Cypress Hills. And here in this low area right in here, Swift Current Creek Plateau. I was just up in there about 2 weeks ago. And then we have these other high plateaus called the Flaxville Surface. And then even down lower we have others. All these are capped by quartzite rocks, which I'll get into. And even here, closer to the Rocky Mountain, here's the Rocky Mountain front right in here. And so those are our planation surfaces. And by the way, look at the scale. That's 100 kilometers or 60 miles. This is huge scale. These things are huge, not just little tiny things. And when you look at the Cypress Hills, when you look at the top, dead flat. That's the western Cypress Hills. There's the central Cypress Hills. And a lot of it has been partly eroded. And I think probably from glacial rivers, because I found big glacial erratics from the Canadian Shield down here, indicating Ice Age rivers probably eroded this. And then in the eastern part of the Cypress Hill, it's still dead flat. And when you drive up onto it, it looks like that. That's a planation surface. One of my favorite planation surfaces, because it has 75 feet of rounded quartzites cemented together. I'll show you pictures of that coming up. Here's the planation surface around Grand Canyon. Remember, I showed you the Grand Canyon, and the top I said was a planation surface. And here it is right here. And this is the North Rim here, and Grand Canyon's in there. The reason you see the North Rim is because this plateau called the Kaibab Plateau slopes down to the south. And Grand Canyon cut at intermediate altitudes, not the low elevations across this plateau. A major mystery, and it's one of the reasons they can't figure out the origin of Grand Canyon, but we can. Anyway, Lester King from the University of Natal in South Africa, he is a world traveler, and he's seen these all over. And he says, a planation of extraordinary smoothness, in other words, dead flat, developed over enormous areas in all the continents. These are continent, even Antarctica. Some of the tops of the mountains sticking up out of the ice sheet are flat-topped. From it, most of the world's present scenery has subsequently been carved by renewed erosion. In other words, these were first formed over huge areas, and then they uplifted, tilted, and dissected so that the area got whittled down. So a lot of times they're just erosional remnants of these. But they indicate they were once much larger, covering all the continents. And here's a sample of a prenation surface in north-central Montana. It was so flat that they had an airport on it right over here. And this is an example of it being destroyed by a creek coming out of the Little Rocky Mountains. That's what we observe, and that's science. Science is what you observe, and there's nothing in observational science that's contrary to the Bible. It's the interpretations of the observations that are contrary, because they put the spin of millions of years, and then when they look at the fossils, they say evolution. It's the interpretation, not the actual observed data. Very key point. But what we're observed by planation surfaces are being destroyed. So here's kind of a summary. This, if it was uniformitarian erosion, uniform processes over millions of years, present processes, on tilted sedimentary rocks, the hard rocks would stand up as ridges, and the soft rocks would end up as being valleys, and some of the eroded material would end up in the valley. We should see that everywhere. We should see no planation surfaces at all. But we see a lot of them looking like this. Tilted, hard, and sedimentary rocks, sheared the same. That takes a powerful current to shear them off the same, leaving rounded boulders at the top. Powerful evidence for the flood from planation surfaces. So in summary, they're not forming today, they're being destroyed. That's what we observe, and that's the science. Once covered a much larger area. Common as erosional remnants globally, not a local flood, a global flood. Difficult to explain by slow processes over millions of years. Powerful evidence for the global flood. Quartzite rocks spread hundreds of miles from their source. Does anyone have a clue what a quartzite rock is? Okay, it's a sandstone that's been heated up and metamorphosed. In other words, a layer of sand was laid down, compressed. You got to compress it with thousands of feet of sediment, and the particles get closer together, and you get cement in there, and you cement them together. A sandstone has maybe about 20% cement, but it still has about 20% air or water inside it. But you drop it down in some basin, heat it up to 300 to 500 degrees centigrade. It recrystallizes the particles, which are mostly silica or glass, like glass, and it recrystallizes, fills up the pores, and becomes very hard and dense. That's a quartzite rock, a metamorphic sandstone. It's one of the hardest rocks in this whole region. And during the erosion, during the Genesis flood, when the floodwaters were running off, it pulverized the softer rocks, granite, except for maybe the quartz pebbles. Basalt is too soft too, by the way. Shale's too soft. But quartzite, pretty hard. And here's kind of the big picture. Wide currents coming across the western Rockies, eroding huge chunks of. I've seen quartzite outcrops in western Montana and northern Idaho that are claimed to be 20,000 feet thick, and you're only seeing the top of them. But from those, it was buried, then it uplifted a lot. See, we had a lot of what's called vertical motions of the rock, down and up, during the flood. Powerful catastrophism. Anyway, it eroded the rocks, rounded them. You round them pretty quick by water, and you send them out to the east. And they get smaller and smaller as you get out here. And I have found them in western North Dakota, up by Saskatoon, up in here. They're said to be in southwest Manitoba. But as more mountains come up, it splits the water, and the current going east continues, and then you have a backwash towards the Pacific Ocean, and it erodes the quartzites and spreads them clear to the Pacific Ocean. You have a lot of them in this area, by the way. I'll tell you where some are. Kind of like this. Now, if I had an artist redo this, this would be continuous. Didn't mean to put these gaps in here. Anyway, they're eroded clear to the Pacific Ocean. And I have found them in, maybe 30 locations. And there's about 30 that I've heard of I haven't been at. And here's the general location of where they're found, right in there. Now, you do find quartzite in the eastern Rocky Mountains in here, but it's not high grade, it's low grade. This is high grade metamorphic sandstone quartzite. That's where they originate. And so you have, from Idaho, you have it spread southeast into Wyoming, clear out into here. This is east and northeast of Jackson, Wyoming. This is 11,000 feet of rounded quartzite rocks piled up in some huge crack, forming mountains of quartzite. They call one gravel mountain, where you can see a cliff of rounded rocks cemented together, 1,000 feet tall. This area is 15,000 feet. They obtain these depths by seismic methods, by the way. I drove up on this, and I was going up the road. It was just rounded quartzite all the way to the top. And other large areas. And even on the Teton Mountains, right in here, we find them. In fact, they're on the top of the Teton Mountains. So we took a 3-day hike, me and this guy, and we found them on the top of a planation surface in the northern Tetons. And these are your quartzites, well rounded. Some of them are cracked, perpendicular, probably by frost action. This is the largest I found up there. See how rounded that is by water action? Top of the Teton Mountains. And we find that they have these percussion marks, these semicircular cracks. Some of them have hundreds of them on it. Now, this is one of the hardest rocks in the world. This implies torrential flow, and that's what the secular scientists say. It's from torrential flow. But they're not forming today. The torrential flow is by some mechanism that we don't observe today. I wonder what that could be. They never do say. Anyway, in Washington and Oregon, you find a lot of locations of them. See, we're right in here somewhere. This is the Horse Heaven Hills. They're extensive on the Horse Heaven Hills to the south of Yakima. They're also found on some of the other ridges, like Rattlesnake Hills, the Saddle Mountains, and the one north of there, and all through the Columbia Gorge. You have them, and you have them outcropping clear to the Pacific Ocean, and you have them outcropping in the Puget Sound area, mixed with the glacial debris. The Ice Age moved all the way down to Olympia, Washington, and it eroded the quartzites. I even found quartzites up here at Chilliwack, British Columbia. They're even on the San Juan Islands. So they're around here. A good location would be, you know where Snipes Mountain is? They're on the south side of Snipes Mountain, those rounded rocks, and a lot of them are iron stained, so you can spot them really easy. They look like orange rocks, Those are some quartzites. You can go take a look. You'll find the percussion marks with them for yourself. So there are a lot of them around here. And northeast Oregon, on top of the Wallowa Mountains. We're at 8,200 feet here, and there's quartzite outcrop here. In fact, there's numerous quartzites on top of the Wallowa Mountains. And they used to have a working placer gold mine up there, because in the finer material around the quartzites, there's gold. So the current's nearest source is 100 miles east, and when it was moving, it moved the gold. It didn't deposit the gold. That takes a powerful current. And this is the largest quartzite we found, and there's some of the finds with the gold in them right there. Now that placer gold mine was in operation until it became a wilderness area, and you know what the government did then. They shut it down. Anyway, we estimated that weighs 440 pounds. Look how smooth and polished and rounded it is from the action of water. That's my son when he was 17 years old. A scale. That's the largest, but there's supposed to be one that big in there. Must have been in that snowdrift. We never found one that big. Anyway, that's on top of the Wallowa Mountains. We've also found quartzites on top of the gravelly mountains of southwest Montana and the Blue Mountains of central Oregon. How do they get on mountains? Did they just hop up there during the flood? No, it implies that the quartzites were eroded and spread, and then the mountains came up and brought some of them up. So it's telling us some time relationships of when mountains arose, like the Teton Mountains arose kind of late in the flood to bring them up to the top of the Tetons. It's telling us a lot of details of the flood. And these plateaus or planation surfaces are capped by quartzite rocks. The Cypress Hill is 75 feet worth. And under the Ice Age debris, here's Saskatoon. These are quartzites in here. And sometimes the glaciers hardly eroded this material at the bottom, which indicates that the glaciers were kind of weak up there. And that's true because there's a place in southwest Saskatchewan that was never glaciated, interesting enough. I've worked on the Ice Age more than the flood. I've got for about 50 years for that one, 40 years for the flood. And here's the top of the Cypress Hills. This is the 75 feet of rounded quartzite rocks capping it. The nearest source is central Idaho. And a lot of them are iron stained, and you find them iron stained around here, like at Snipes Mountain. They're beautifully iron stained. It must have been a high iron environment when they were moving through the floodwaters. And here's the biggest percussion marks I've ever seen on a quartzite are these right here. Well, we think that this occurred during powerful turbulence of these hard rocks banging underwater. We can't duplicate it with a sledgehammer. In fact, you can't hardly crack open a rock with a sledgehammer. These are so hard, so hard. I got to hit them with all my strength just to crack one open that's big. Here's kind of the upshot of this. We can estimate the minimum current speed by open flow channel equations in civil engineering, which my friend in Great Falls, who's a civil engineer, did. Here's the big picture right here. Moving out of the Rocky Mountains over the Cypress Hills, the big ones were being rolled around on the surface, eroding it down to this level. It probably was way up in here and eroded down to this level. Then small to medium-sized ones were carried up in turbulence and come banging down. So there's a relationship between the fall velocity based on the maximum size and the horizontal velocity. Pardon me for all the details, but I have to say a little bit about the details. Anyway, based on a 6-inch wide bullet-shaped rock that width like that as being the maximum carried up in the current and come crashing down, The minimum current speeds are 65 miles an hour and 180 feet of water. Those are minimums. 65 miles an hour is about 2 to 3 times the velocity of the fastest flash floods on Earth. 2 to 3 times the fastest flash floods on Earth. They go down steep mountain valleys. We're talking about powerful evidence of the floodwaters coming off the continents. And these quartzite rocks were spread from Idaho mainly, 800 miles to the east-northeast across what is now the Continental Divide. I mean, no normal river is going to do that. No present process is going to do that. This is powerful evidence for the Genesis flood runoff. Summary, spread 800 miles east from its source in the western Rockies west of the Continental Divide. Spread 400 miles west to the Pacific Ocean. Percussion marks indicate torrential flow, powerful evidence for flood runoff. Water gaps. A water gap is essentially a gorge through the mountains, kind of like the Columbia Gorge between Washington and Oregon. But that's not a very significant one because that's actually one of the lowest areas in the Cascades. So however you look at it, if millions of years, if you had a lot of sediments higher up, that would have been the low areas where the water would have gone through anyway. So that's not too significant. But there's a lot of other water gaps that are, where the water or the river could have easily gone around, but for some reason cuts right through in a gorge. But rivers don't do that. They don't go uphill and down. So how does it happen? They don't know, but they got 4 ideas. They always have ideas because they do not like a theoretical vacuum of not knowing. So they throw another hypothesis out there. So here's my favorite water gap near Cody, Wyoming. I'm looking west towards Yellowstone Park, which is up in here. The Shoshone River starts in southeast Yellowstone and flows east down a valley. And it comes to this mountain range. It's called the Rattlesnake Mountains. They're 2,500 feet tall. They're cored by granite. It's a granite uplift, and here's the sedimentary rocks banked up against it. And it's in front of the mountains in here called the Absaroka Volcanics. And anyway, the Shoshone River should have went around here because this mountain range plunges down and disappears 2 miles to the south. And there's a low area that I'm going to show you right in here that the river could easily have gone around when the sediments were higher if it was eroded by millions of years of slow processes. But it's just continued east. And I'm going through a water gap 2,500 feet deep. And there it is. They built a road through it. Not only that, they made a dam through it. In fact, it's so low. This is the low area. Here's the water gap right here. It's so low here, they had to put another dam there so the water didn't escape out into the Bighorn Basin and cause floods. Anyway, you have some nice water gaps around here. Do you have any rivers that go through mountains or mountain ranges? How about the Yakima River from Ellensburg down to Union Gap? It's going through 6 water gaps. Now, the Yakima River should have continued east because that pass to the east is only 1,000 feet higher than it is now. But say 200,000 years ago, the sediments would supposedly be higher, and so it could easily go east into the Columbia River. But instead, it takes a right-hand turn and heads south and cuts through about 5 lava ridges. This area is composed of big lava ridges going east-west, separated by valleys, which the Yakima Valley is just one of them. And this is a water gap in the Appalachians. This is north of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on the Susquehanna River. There's 3 or 4 aligned water gaps. You're seeing the first one right here. Now the rivers in this area could have gone around these ridges, but no, they end up going right through them. They don't know why. And the Appalachians have 1,700 water gaps. 1,700. And there's also what's called wind gaps. Those are water gaps wannabes, but they weren't carved deep enough, so just wind goes through them. I'll show you pictures. By the way, you have wind gaps around here. North of Sunnyside, that pass is a wind gap. And also, what's it called? Pass? Conowak Pass, yes. That's another wind gap. For the water, it ended up cutting right where you see it. But when it was up higher, it was going through Conowak Pass also, and then that quit, and it ended up going through, forming the river that we see today. But anyway, these things are global. The Zagros Mountains has the most amazing ones, and a guy wrote a PhD thesis, and he published a book called The Zagros Streams. And notice some of the language he talks about. See, the Zagros Mountains, their water gaps they have hundreds of them. It's in southwest Iran, and they're up to 8,000 feet deep. And he says that Zagros drainage pattern is distinctive by virtue of its disregard of major geological obstruction, in other words, mountains, both on a general scale and in detail. In other words, it doesn't go down valleys for very long like it's supposed to go. It'll go down for a valley for a while and then cut right through a mountain and sometimes come back out. It does all kinds of crazy things. It blows their mind. Anyway, certain streams ignore structure completely. I like this language. Some appear to seek obstacles to transect. What? Anyway, that's not unusual. Now, the deepest water gap in North America is not Grand Canyon, which is a water gap. It's the longest water gap. The deepest is Hell's Canyon, where it cut through the Wallowa Mountains and the Seven Devils Mountains in Idaho. In Idaho, it's 8,000 feet high. And there's other water gaps that are even deeper. The ones through the Himalayas are the deepest on Earth, where the rivers start in the southern Tibetan Plateau, and they start heading south towards the Indian Ocean. And the structure, the mountain ranges, caused them to be shifted a little, go down valleys. Then suddenly they just cut right through all those mountains, right to the Indian Ocean. The deepest water gap is on the Aran River, east of Mount Everest, 4 miles deep water gap. So there's thousands of these across the earth. And we even have an analog how they formed in a flood. I'm saying that they formed in flood runoff. But how many have heard of the Lake Missoula flood? A good amount of you. Okay, that affected this area. The waters, we had an ice dam, 2,000 foot deep lake in the valleys of western Montana, broke through the ice, carved up eastern Washington. That's why you got all these coulees. They call them coulees. Eroded 50 cubic miles of hard basalt and soft silt that's on top. And when it got down to the southern part of south central Washington, or southeast Washington, it hit a ridge. Right here, it's 500 feet high above this Washtuckna Coulee and the Snake River. And the Palouse River used to flow down Washtuckna Coulee into the Columbia River, but when the flood came down from the north, it carved across the ridge, carving a water gap that started wide, 8 miles wide here, and then became a narrow canyon. It sort of looks like Grand Canyon in ways. And then it carved another one here. And the Palouse River, instead of continuing this way, took a left-hand turn and went through that newly formed water gap in the Lake Missoula flood into the Snake River. And this was too high for water to flow through because it has a barrier there, and only wind goes through there for a wind gap. So that's an example where a huge flood, 5 times the volume of Lake Erie, spread over eastern Washington, carving it up. It was 600 feet deep going over Spokane, Washington, for instance, 1,000 feet deep going through the Columbia Gorge. It was a huge thing. In fact, it was so huge that the secular scientists rejected it for 40 years, despite hundreds of pieces of evidence out there. Hundreds. It's an amazing story. Anyway, let's kind of give you the upshot of this. During wide currents, flowing perpendicular to ridges or mountains that are starting to form, it has low areas, and so it takes advantage of those low areas and accelerates through them. For the same amount of water has to go through more narrow areas, so it has to accelerate. And when it accelerates, it erodes faster. In fact, erosion is to the fourth power of the velocity of approximately. You increase the velocity 2 times, the erosion goes up 16 times. So it continues like this. And finally, for some reason, maybe current shifted, some mountain uplifted in front of it or something. You had a lot of things going on during the flood like this. This gives up. And all the water ends up flowing through there, carving it all the way down to where the rivers take advantage of it, forming a water gap, leaving this one high and dry as a wind gap. Pretty easily formed in the flood, but yet they're huge mysteries to secular earth science. Huge mysteries. Then you might say, if there's all this powerful evidence, why can't mainstream scientists see it? Well, I was a rotating shift worker for 30 years, and meaning I was a zombie for those 30 years. If you've ever flown to Australia and then back again in a week or two, you know what it feels like. Anyway, I tried to figure out, well, how can we do this shift work better? So I read a book by some Stanford researchers on how to do shift work better. They say stay on the same shift 3 to 4 weeks before you change. So that took about 70% of the fatigue out of the job, so that was a good benefit. Anyway, I read the book, The Promise of Sleep, by Stanford biologist William Dement. He was one of the discoverers of REM sleep. And I came across this on page 34. I've come across things like this before in the geological literature. He says, even when they are looking, people usually see only what they expect to find, and they do not see what they assume for whatever reason could not exist. In other words, the universities say slow processes over millions of years, slow processes over millions of years, so it's locked in like that, and that's all they see in a huge cliff that goes for hundreds of miles. I should say the sediments go for hundreds of miles, and you see it on a cliff. Oh, it's slow processes. So, see, it's locked in, and it's amazing how locked in it is, and that's why they can't see it. So, the Bible makes sense. The flood's a real event. We have a lot of evidence for it, not only from a global flood from Scripture, but from geology. And Jesus believed in a global flood. The ark is big enough and very stable. And the flood is one of the most despised events in the culture. In fact, that was the first thing that they rejected by the so-called Enlightenment, starting in the 1700s and early 1800s. Yet there is abundant evidence for a global flood. And if you can believe in a global flood, you can easily believe the whole Bible is God's Word, which tells us how to live here on earth. Lots of things that tell us how to live here on earth, including Proverbs, and how to go to heaven. And what's that last one look like? I could sum it up in one verse, Romans 10:9. This is a theme for the whole New Testament. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart, that's a strong belief, that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. In other words, accept Jesus as your Savior from your sins and the Lord of your life. And you should be reading the Bible regularly to find out what it says. It's full of great information, even in areas where you would never imagine, like the genealogies of Genesis 1, 5, 10, and 11. Anyway, a new Gallup report asked the questions of what causes people to doubt Christianity. Anyway, it's a Barna report, May 2023. Those with no faith said the number 2 reason was science. And when they say science, they mean evolution and millions of years. That's why I put science in quote. Because real science, that's the observations, you see. None of that contradicts the Bible. It's their interpretations. So, and number 2 was science. And for those of other faiths, it was tied for number 4. So science is a big thing. And that's why I and so many other people have been doing research to answer these challenges that they give us. I mean, there's hundreds of them. So, and we've been able to answer challenges. We do have answers for your sake when you wonder, well, how'd that happen? What about carbon-14? What about dinosaurs? We do have the answers. It counters much of the misinformation in the culture. The Western culture is just full of misinformation. We need answers for ourselves, children, and grandchildren, and the reasons why we have so many resources out there. That's why I do research. And if you have questions, Creation Ministries International put questions and answers, about 60 of them in this book called the Answers Book. Common questions that you would have. So, the Answers Book. And since I don't really talk about evolution much, and I haven't written a resource on that, I borrowed this one here, or got this one. Evolution's Achilles' heels. Achilles' heels is plural. These are 8 fatal problems with evolution by 15 PhD scientists. We have a book and a DVD form. Those are the only 2 resources I have not personally produced myself. And here's some of the resources coming up. And this is the motivation for writing one of them. I was a weather forecaster for 30 years, and I did this. I probably ruined thousands of outdoor activities. But I've since repented, and I've become a creation scientist. Now, when I first came in the Weather Service, National Weather Service, we can barely forecast the weather a day in advance. So we did this a lot. But let me tell you, I keep a track of the computer models, and they're so much better now. You can count on them usually 5 days in advance. They're really accurate. Sometimes up to 9 or 10, I'm surprised. Most of the time not, but they can get the general pattern. But they're getting really good. I'm impressed. I wish I had those when I was forecasting the weather. So, I wrote this resource here. Some pastors came up to me and said, well, you got several books for laymen on this millions of years stuff that bothers us a lot. In fact, this bothers more people, Christians than evolution. So I said, I'm going to try to write a resource for a person with no science background. So that's what I did, The Deep Dive in Deception. It has a subtitle called Examining the Case for Millions of Years, which is the title I wanted, but they made me change it because it's too dull sounding. You know, people who publish books make you change your titles. So anyway, that's a pretty recent book. This talk, you can learn more and a lot more from this resource, How Noah's Flood Shaped Our Earth. And it'll go into a lot more stuff than I talked about. I only scratched the surface. I scratched the surface on the evidence. And since I'm from Washington State and I live in Montana, I go back and forth through the Lake Missoula flood, so I couldn't help but take a look at all this stuff. And so I got a DVD. In fact, I got 3 DVDs from this group right here, Awesome Science Media. This is not your talking head one necessarily. This shows me out in the field demonstrating this. The Lake Missoula flood, I have one on the Ice Age and one on the waters running off the continents. But that's one resource I've done. And I've done a lot of Ice Age sources, of which this one is probably the second one I wrote with my wife. Life in the Great Ice Age, teaching young kids as well as adults about the Ice Age, caveman, woolly mammoths, and so forth. So that's enough for the advertisements. I have a lot of other resources there on weather, global warming. I have a talk on global warming. And DVDs for all ages. I have 5 children's books, one on weather that's a homeschool course for all 3 ages, early, middle, and high school, the weather book. So I got a lot of resources to help bless you. And I want to leave you with these websites. Creation Encounters is a group from close to here. They're out of Hood River, Oregon, and they do tours, the Columbia Gorge, but they go to Yellowstone now and then. They probably go up in this area. This channeled scablands and Lake Missoula Flood are one of their favorite areas to go. So if you want a tour, sometimes they go to Death Valley one time. So anyway, that's their website. I have my own websites, which I'm going to modify and make it more interactive, because I find all kinds of great material in those 50 Earth Science journals that I don't have time to write up. So I can write a 1 or 2 page little note to let people know, hey, this is a great piece of evidence for the flood. And then for the Catholic people, I believe, that are in this audience, they have a creation group called the Colby Center, based in Virginia. So, Colby Center for the Study of Creation. So, that's it for that, and I thank you. And maybe some questions and answers?
Well,
Yeah.
I had something interesting. I don't know if it has anything to do with flooding, but when we built our house in Sela, we were going to put in a basement. And so when we dug down the 8 or 9 or 10 feet or whatever, there was an area that was all sand, and then the rest of it was just plain dirt. And I kept digging and digging and digging, trying to get sand, how far down it would go, and I could never get that layer of sand to go away. So does that have anything to do with the sediments or from flooding or not?
Yeah, that's part of the Genesis flood. The sediments around here have been eroded probably several thousand feet. So what you're seeing is after that erosion. And I saw a cliff today that had sand. It's volcanic sand. And the rounded rocks, I saw a lot of conglomerate. It was volcanic rock. I was looking for quartzite, didn't find it, but it's volcanic rock. I see some of that up by Ellensburg, and if I went west of here towards White Swan, I think it is, there's some layers of rounded volcanic rock. So that's part of that, but you didn't get into there. You just got through this. It looked like some sand layers, poorly consolidated, but others look pretty hard, the conglomerate layers. So.
Well, this was beautiful sand, so I dug a whole bunch of it for the grandkids to play with.
Well, that's a good use of it. Anyway, anything more on your mind? Yes.
I didn't quite catch the dimensions of the Missoula flood. Can you run through those again?
Yeah, the Missoula flood, that was formed at the peak of the Ice Age, where the Clark Fork River in Montana was blocked by a finger of the ice sheet in British Columbia that came down into northern Washington. And it formed a lake 2,000 feet deep at the Montana-Idaho border, about 4 to 5 times the volume of Lake Erie. But it was blocked by ice, so it's not going to last very long, is it? So it broke through and it emptied in a couple days, spread through eastern Washington, eroded 50 cubic miles of eastern Washington, and spread it down to the Willamette Valley. That's why the Willamette Valley is so rich. It stole your Palouse sill. And then it went out into the Pacific Ocean and formed your coulees. It formed Grand Coulee in a matter of a couple of days. And then it formed an instant lake centered on Pasco, 600-foot deep instant lake. And that lake, it's known that when you fill up a reservoir, it causes earthquakes. But when you have one fill up in a couple of days to 600 feet, you're going to have some massive earthquakes. Massive earthquakes will touch off volcanoes ready to explode. And that's why you find ash of Mount St. Helens in some of the backwash material up the Walla Walla Valley and the Yakima River Valley. And you can find a volcanic ash layer near the top. And it backwashed up, forming layers. You see, clear up to Yakima, you got to go down to the lower Yakima Valley around Snipes Mountain, just